Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the very first of the Animal Welfare Behaviour Ethics and Law Research Group public meetings. I'm Dr. Lisa Riley, I'm the lead of the research group, and I'm thrilled to have you along with us today. I'm also thrilled to introduce to you my colleague, Professor Andrew Knight. Professor Knight is going to be delivering the talk today on whether cats and dogs should go vegan. I've known Andrew for 6 years now. We've been working together at the University of Winchester. Andrew is a veterinary professor of animal welfare, and he specialises in the really challenging areas of animal welfare and ethics. He's not afraid to ask the questions that perhaps other researchers might be too frightened to ask. And that's reflected in his prominent work in this area. It's a real challenge to take pet animals that we traditionally know as eating meat and to suggest to the public that they might be better off, or maybe even just as well on a vegan diet. But Andrew has certainly compiled a wealth of research in this area. Andrew is an adjunct professor at Griffith University in Australia, and he was the founding director of the former Centre for Animal Welfare here at the University of Winchester. He was instrumental in developing both our Bachelor of Arts undergraduate degree in Animal Welfare and Society and our distance learning MSc degree, Animal Welfare, Behaviour, Ethics and Law also. And more recently, I've had the absolute pleasure of being Andrew's Director of Studies for his second PhD. He's one of those very rare academics that has generated 2 PhDs in his lifetime. And, maybe there'll be a third, who knows? And on that PhD, Andrew really celebrated and fully investigated the palatability, the health aspects and the sustainability aspects and environmental impacts of feeding our companion cats and dogs a meat-based versus vegan diet. And that's what we'll hear about this evening. So, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Andrew, for delivering this lecture, and it's over to you.
I've been asked to talk about should dogs and cats go vegan, so I'll get underway. The idea that dogs or cats could possibly be vegan seems a bit outrageous at first glance. We often think of them as carnivores. In fact, they're not quite carnivores. Dogs have co-evolved with humans for the last 20 to 40,000 years. And they started off as wolves. Wolves used to follow our ancestors around the landscape as we hunted and gathered, particularly hunting large game animals. And the wolves that were a little bit more confident, less timid, would approach more closely to human campfires and sometimes receive scraps from those campfires. And in time, the wolves with better temperaments started to collaborate more closely with our human ancestors and to join our hunting parties. And over time, those wolf hybrids that had genetic adaptations enabling them to derive nutritional benefit from scraps of meat, cooked starchy root vegetables, which were the staples of our ancestors' diets, and a variety of other mixed foodstuffs. The wolves that had these genetic mutations enabling them to derive nutritional benefit from this more mixed diet did better than the wolves that did not have those genetic mutations and were purely carnivores. And so the population of these animals changed over time and evolved into modern domesticated dogs who are biologically omnivorous. So they're able to subsist on a variety of essentially scraps from human diets is how they've evolved to live, and most of those are actually or have historically not been meat. They've been actually starchy root vegetables, which were, as I say, the mainstay of our ancestors' diets, along with meat scraps. Cats have had a different ancestry. They haven't co-evolved with people for as long as dogs have. Their evolutionary timeframe with people has been about 8,000 years, and their role has been different too. They were welcomed to our human communities, our early human communities, really as guards of our food stores, our grain stores, because they hunted rodents that would otherwise plague our food reserves. They did not co-evolve eating cooked starchy root vegetable scraps from our campfires, and they have not developed the adaptations that dogs have developed, and so they remain very much biologically carnivorous. This means that in their natural environments, they're not able to derive very much nutritional benefit from plant-based materials. Although both dogs and cats would have naturally consumed these, primarily in the gastrointestinal tracts of prey species, and of course in the case of dogs from these starchy root vegetable scraps as well. None of this is very relevant at all to today's domesticated dogs and cats, both of who are maintained in modern households on a variety of body parts from animals such as cows, sheep, pigs, fish that they would never naturally consume, along with all sorts of unnatural additives packaged up into dry kibble or to wet formulations and fed at predictable times daily. This bears very little resemblance to the feeding regime of an ancestral dog or cat. For example, cats would naturally, in their natural environments, would hunt and kill a variety of small mammals, birds, large insects. And when they did make a kill, which would be at unpredictable times each day, they would gorge as much as possible to prevent consumption by competitor animals. And this would be followed by uncertain periods of hunger. So this is the natural feeding regime of an ancestral cat, and it bears little resemblance to the diet of a modern domesticated house cat today. What dogs and cats actually need, of course, are diets that are nutritionally sound, sufficiently palatable and digestible, and there's no requirement that they actually receive meat. There is a requirement they receive a set of ingredients that provides them with all the nutrients necessary for dogs and cats, and indeed all species have specific nutritional requirements. Today, people are increasingly considering plant-based lifestyles for these sorts of reasons, and I refer to them as mega trends. Over the decades, there's been increasing concern amongst human populations about health and well-being, and this is also translating to concerns about our companion animal health and well-being. Dogs and cats are living longer. People are wanting better standards of care for them, including better standards of veterinary care and better diets. The environmental concerns of the livestock sector are a huge concern to many people. We know, for example, that the food system consumes around about 2/3 of the Earth's ice-free land surface. And of that vast area, around about 80% is given over to livestock production, whether grazing the livestock animals directly on pasture or growing feed crops to feed to livestock animals or housing them in intensive farms. So that 80% of all agricultural land produces about 18% of the calories and about 37% of the protein that we consume. So it's a very inefficient way of producing food and consumes vast amounts of land, water and other resources. People are increasingly concerned about the ethics of the production of these animals for food. We know that of the roughly 80 billion land animals that are killed each year for food, and that's about 10 times the human population of the Earth, and around about 1 to 3 trillion fish and other marine animals. Of those that are farmed, about 90% are intensively farmed, and that's about 3/4 of all land animals and almost all intensively farmed fish. So these intensively farmed animals are generally maintained at very high stocking densities in fairly small spaces that are environmentally quite barren, with very little opportunities to exercise highly motivated behavioural needs and urges. So this is chronically stressful to these animals, and even those few lucky ones that are raised in better conditions are generally killed at a very premature stage of life. So people are increasingly concerned about the animal welfare and the ethical implications of doing this to such large numbers of sentient animals. And finally, there's a food justice concern. We know that the consumption of grain is very inequitable around the world, varying in 2024. The calculations are just under 29 kilogram per person of wheat being expected to be consumed in developing nations, compared to over 96 kilograms of wheat per person in wealthy nations such as North America and much of Europe. This inequitable distribution occurs primarily because of the great relative overconsumption of livestock produce in wealthy nations, where most of the grain is not being consumed directly as grain, but rather indirectly in the form of livestock produce. Because most of the grain that's fed to livestock animals doesn't directly produce usable products such as meat, milk and eggs. Most of it actually goes into supporting the bodily maintenance processes of livestock animals, resulting in most of that food energy being lost. So because there's this overconsumption of livestock animals in wealthy nations compared to developing nations, it drives up the prices of grain globally, meaning that around about 1 in 9 people, or 820 plus million people on the planet, suffer from hunger and malnutrition. It's been calculated that we actually produce enough grain and other food crops to feed double the human population of the Earth. But if we were all to follow the livestock-rich diets of the people in the wealthiest 20 nations, we would actually need 7 planet Earths to produce that much grain. So this inequitable distribution of grain consumption around the world is very much contributing to hunger and malnutrition. So because of issues such as these, increasing concern about these issues, people are increasingly considering alternative diets for themselves and also for their companion animals. And the alternatives that have been rising in prominence are these ones that you can see here. Of these, vegan pet foods are by far the most developed. As you can see, the vegan pet food market is growing very rapidly. Last year, the vegan dog food market alone was calculated as being worth about $14 billion US, expected to almost double over the coming decade. And as you can see, the high annual increase of 7% is not uniform around the world. India is obviously one of the world's most populous nations and has a strong tradition of vegetarianism, and the potential growth there is expected to be 31% rather than 7% per year. But what evidence is there about the health of dogs and cats maintained on vegan diets? Until the last 3 years, there was very little evidence. There have really only been about 2 credible studies that had been published. This is one of them that was published by a colleague of mine, a veterinarian, Dr. Lorelei Wakefield, in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association, 2006. This was the first such study, and she studied reported health outcomes in more than 30 cats maintained on vegetarian diets for at least 1 year. And in fact, all but 3 of those were actually vegan diets. In 3 cases, the cats were partly maintained on table scraps as well, which may not have been vegan. As well as 50 plus cats maintained on meat-based diets for at least a year as well. The table simply tells us that there were no significant differences between these 2 dietary groups in age, sex, body condition, housing or perceived health status, with most being described as being healthy or generally healthy. The next important study that was published was a study of sprint racing sled dogs in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2009. And I struggle to think of any dogs with higher dietary energy needs than dogs that pull sleds through deep snow for days and sometimes weeks on end over very long distances under competitive racing conditions. So in this study, 12 sprint racing Siberian Huskies were fed either a commercial diet, meat-based diet recommended for active dogs, or a meat-free one formulated to the same nutrient specifications, and they're split into 2 groups of 6. was their sole nutrient intake for about 4 months, including 2.5 months of competitive racing. Blood samples were collected at the beginning, during and end of the study, and veterinary health checks likewise done at these times. Blood results for all dogs were within the normal range. All of them had an increased shift towards a higher red blood cell count, which is a normal athletic response to sustained exercise. You see that in human athletes as well. And the veterinarian assessed all dogs to be in excellent physical condition. So that was the next significant study. After that, there wasn't very much that was published in this area. There were several studies looking at the nutritional content of different diets, including vegan or vegetarian pet foods, which my former PhD student, Dr. Lietzberger, and myself reviewed in this article that was published in Animals in 2016. So we reviewed 4 studies of nutritional content, which had been published by 2016 of different vegan pet foods, and also the existing studies of health outcomes of dogs and cats maintained on these diets. And this study attracted huge attention, probably partly because of the title, and it's currently the 3rd most viewed article ever in the journal Animals. It's been viewed about 120,000 times. We basically, after reviewing all the evidence in the field at that time, we concluded that both cats and dogs may thrive on vegetarian diets, and indeed this is also true of nutrition sound vegan diets, but they must be nutritionally complete and reasonably balanced. And of course, neither dogs nor cats, as I said before, have a biological requirement for meat or any other particular ingredient. What they do have requirements for is a specific set of nutrients. And modern vegan diets are formulated by pet food companies from plant, mineral and synthetic supplements, all of which are also included in meat-based pet foods. And they're formulated to try to provide the full nutrient profiles required by dogs and cats. So as I say, biologically, there's no requirement for meat. There is a requirement for a certain set of nutrients for both dogs and cats. So it's kind of common sense if you think about it. So there wasn't anything more published until very recently. In the last 3 years in particular, the research output in this field has really taken off very quickly. The first really important study was this one, which was produced by veterinarian Dr. Sarah Dodd and her research group. So she's a veterinary nutritional specialist who completed a PhD on vegan pet food last year. That was the first one in the world. And with her research group at Guelph Veterinary School, which is one of Canada's leading veterinary schools, she published this study from her PhD. And she essentially looked at reported health outcomes for more than 1,000 cats, of who nearly 200 were maintained on vegan diets. And she used the term plant-based for cats on vegan diets in this study. And she says that the important part's the bit in the red box. She says that fewer cats fed these plant-based diets were reported to have gastrointestinal and liver disorders. That's interesting because she got the same result with dogs later on. You'll see that. And she also said that cats fed plant-based diets were more likely to have more ideal body condition scores. And with cats, that usually means a reduction in being overweight or obese, which is the most common body weight problem. More owners of cats fed plant-based diets reported their cat to be in very good health. So all of these differences were statistically significant. For all other reported health outcomes, there were no statistically significant differences between the cats fed meat and the cats fed vegan diets. She also studied the lifespans of previously owned cats, and you can see them there. The lifespans of the plant-based or vegan cats is indicated in green, and they appear to be living longer than the cats fed meat or the cats fed mixed diet of meat and vegan pet food. But this difference was not statistically significant in this study. Dodd and colleagues also published this very helpful survey of pet guardian or owner attitudes towards diets and their feeding practices. And essentially, of around 3,000 primarily North American pet guardians, they found that about 35% of pet owners who were not already feeding a plant-based diet were interested in doing so, and there are certain key concerns that those owners wanted to be satisfied. And then in 2020, I conducted an even larger survey of more than 4,000 pet guardians, and these were primarily based in the United Kingdom and Europe. And remember, Dodd and colleagues found 35% were interested in plant-based diets. I found that 54% of those feeding conventional or raw meat were not interested in alternatives, but 46% were interested in alternatives. So a little bit larger than the 35% found by Dodd and colleagues. But I wasn't just offering plant-based diets as alternatives, I was also offering cell-grown meat products as alternatives. So the cell-grown or laboratory-grown meat diets, if and when they're available, were the most popular choice, but second most popular were vegetarian and vegan diets. And these are already well developed in the marketplace, whereas the other alternatives are at a very early stage of development. I asked the pet guardians what the top characteristics were that these alternative diets would need to provide before they would realistically consider choosing them. And there were a long list which were fairly consistent with prior studies, including the study of Dodd and colleagues. In order, the top 5 concerns that pet guardians would need to be satisfied that an alternative diet would need to provide before they would realistically consider purchasing it were these. They want to be satisfied that the health of their pets would be safeguarded, the diets would be nutritionally sound and of good quality, that they'd be sufficiently palatable so that their pets would enjoy eating the diets, they would not suffer from consuming the diets. And finally, they'd need to be satisfied about good environmental sustainability outcomes. Interestingly, cost did not feature in the top 5. It came in as item number 6, actually, in the list. So my research since then has been focused on examining each of these top 5 areas of concern to pet guardians. With respect to pet health, which is the first concern, we published this study of health outcomes in more than 2,500 dogs, which was the largest study of its kind just last year, actually. And that looked at more than, well, you can see the numbers of dogs in the 3 different dietary groups there: conventional meat, raw meat, and vegan diets. I asked people to report the number of visits to veterinarians in the last year, hypothesising that increased numbers of veterinary visits would be consistent with treatment for a possible healthcare problem. Whether the animals had needed to receive any kind of medication or not in the last year, whether after initially being on a vegan or some other diet, they needed to progress onto a therapeutic or medical diet. For those who'd recently seen a vet and felt sure of the assessment of their veterinarian, I asked what was that assessment of healthcare status of their animal? What were the guardian's own opinions of the health status of their animal? What percentage of these animals was unwell based on the reported assessments of the vets? And for those that were unwell, did they suffer from just one health disorder, or was it more than one? What was the average number of health disorders per unwell animal? I also asked about the prevalence of the 22 most common health disorders in dogs. 49% of dogs fed conventional meat were unwell, 43% of those fed raw meat were unwell, and 36% of those fed vegan diets were unwell. The average number of cases of illness per unwell dog varied from about 1.65 for those fed conventional meat down to about 1.5 for the other 2 groups. The 22 most common health disorders in dogs were, first of all, gastrointestinal problems, followed by skin coat disorders, musculoskeletal, and so on. And the probabilities of suffering from one of these 22 most common health disorders was highest when dogs were fed conventional meat for 11 out of 22 of them, highest when dogs were fed raw meat for 8 out of 22, and highest when dogs were fed vegan diets for 3 out of 22 of these disorders. So on the basis of these conclusions, and also considering the dietary hazards that are well known to be associated with raw meat diets in particular, and that is nutritional imbalances and also bacterial and other pathogenic hazards, we considered that the healthiest diet with certainly with the fewest dietary hazards were nutritionally sound vegan diets for dogs. So that study was published in the Open Access journal PLOS One in 2022, and that's been reported in about over 400 news outlets globally, including New Scientist. So it's attracted a lot of attention. The next really significant study that came out in this field was published by Dodd and colleagues from Guelph once again, and they looked at information from over 1,100 dog guardians, including more than 350 feeding solely vegan diets for 3 years on average, so quite a long period of time. The vegan dogs were more likely to reported in very good health, less likely to suffer from gastrointestinal liver disorders, the same as with the cats, by the way, but also less likely to suffer from ocular disorders, which was different from the result in the cats. They also looked at the lifespans of previously owned dogs, more than 1,000 of those. In this case, once again, it looked like the dogs fed vegan diets were living longer than the dogs fed meat or mixed diets. With the cats, this result was not statistically significant, but with the dogs, it was statistically significant, meaning that we can be highly confident this was not a chance result. So on average, dogs fed meat-based diets were living 12.6 years, and those fed vegan diets were living about 14.1 years. In veterinary practice, we sometimes think of 1 year as being of a dog's life as being equivalent to perhaps 7 years of a human life, in which case 1.5 years would equate to around about a decade of extra life for a person. So that's a really significant extra duration of lifespan. On top of this, we know that dogs are not just living longer, but they seem to be living better as well, because across the 10 studies now of health outcomes of dogs fed vegetarian and vegan diets, there appear to be 2 clusters of healthcare benefits that are coming up across multiple studies. One relates to having lowered rates of itchy skin and ear canal problems, and this stands to reason if we bear in mind that dogs fed vegan diets are not consuming animal-sourced allergens such as beef, lamb, pork, and so on, which in some dogs can trigger those conditions. The second benefit seems to relate to a reduction in excess body weight, being overweight and obese, improved mobility, and a reduction in musculoskeletal disorders. So these dogs seem to be having more active and better quality lives, as well as living longer. So this is potentially a very significant welfare benefit directly for these dogs. As I said, there are now 10 studies, and in fact, 2 of those are veterinary student master's theses, the rest are published studies, as well as 1 systematic review that includes even more relevant studies. And these have directly examined health outcomes in dogs maintained on vegetarian and vegan diets. If you click on my website, sustainablepetfood.info, under the health tab, you'll see a page like this, a short summary, about a paragraph describing the key results of all of these studies, and a link through to where the study is available open access on the internet or can be downloaded. As I say, there's 10 of these studies, 9 now support the use of these diets. They demonstrate equivalent or superior health outcomes in dogs maintained on these diets. The one that doesn't is the oldest study with the smallest sample size and the least realistic study conditions. It dates from 1987, involving 8 dogs doing an exercise regime that bears no resemblance to the exercise levels of domesticated dogs today. So clearly the weight of evidence overwhelmingly supports use of nutritionally sound vegan dog food. What about cats? We also published recently the largest study to date of health outcomes of cats fed meat-based or vegan diets, and in this case we didn't split into conventional or raw meat, we just looked at meat as a single category. We started off this time by controlling for differences in these dietary groups in age, sex, neutering status, and also location, in case some of the cats might have been going outdoors and hunting animals, so we controlled for that as well. We looked at the same general indicators of illness, and you can see those along the x-axis, increased numbers of veterinary visits, medication use, and so on. The dashed horizontal line shows the odds of these outcomes, the relative odds of these outcomes occurring for cats fed meat. And as you can see, for cats fed vegan diets, there's a reduction in odds indicated by the blue circle with the vertical 95% confidence interval ranges. There's a reduction in the odds of these outcomes occurring for all 7 of these general indicators of illness, but in all cases you can see that the 95% confidence interval crosses the dashed horizontal line, meaning that none of these differences are statistically significant. Collectively, however, they do constitute quite a strong trend. We again looked at cats with average characteristics, so average age, sex, neutering status and location, and calculated the risks of these general indicators of illness occurring for cats fed meat in the first column, cats fed vegan diets in the second column, and the reduction of risk for cats fed vegan diets in the third column ranged from about 4% up to 55%, as you can see. The percentage of cats that was unwell was 42% of those fed meat and 37% of those fed vegan diets. And the average number of cases of illness per unwell cat varied from about 1.6 to 1.3. The 22 most common health disorders in cats were different from those in dogs. In cats, the most common disorders were dental oral disorders, followed by body weight, followed by gastrointestinal. The probabilities of suffering from these disorders were highest in cats fed meat for 15 out of 22, for 2/3 of them, and highest in cats fed vegan diets for 1/3 of these health disorders. So based on all of these results, we concluded once again that the healthiest diets with the fewest nutritional hazards were nutritionally sound vegan diets. We published that study also in PLOS One last year, and that's also been reported in media outlets globally. So with respect to studies of health outcomes in cats, there are now 3 studies that have examined health outcomes in cats maintained on vegetarian and vegan diets. And again, if you click on the same tab, but this time under health of cats, you'll get a similar page to the dog page, a summary of each study and a link through to the actual original study. All 3 support the use of these diets, providing that they're nutritionally sound. And again, it's clear that the weight of evidence supports the use of nutritionally sound vegan cat food. I've been publishing letters in the veterinary press. These are from Veterinary Times, the main veterinary news journal in the United Kingdom, summarising the collected studies so far about the health of dogs and cats maintained on vegan diets, pointing out that the weight of evidence supports the use of these diets, provided that they are nutritionally sound. This seems to have been having some effects. UK Pet Food is the Pet Food Manufacturers Association here in the United Kingdom, which includes more than 100 manufacturers and nearly all of those in the industry. They revised their fact sheet early last year to now support the use of vegan pet food for dogs and cats, providing that it's formulated to be nutritionally sound. I should mention that the British Veterinary Association has historically been opposed to the use of vegan diets for cats and dogs, but they also now have a working group to review their position with the aim of considering all of the recent scientific evidence that's been published in this field and hopefully producing a position that is in line with the evidence base in this field. which of course supports the use of these diets, providing that they are nutritionally sound. So that's a pretty thorough, I think, addressing of the first concern that pet guardians said that they had about these vegan diets before they would seriously consider choosing them. For the second and third concerns, nutritional soundness and good quality, I've only got a single slide, and that relates to a study published by my wonderful colleague in Lisa's research group, Natalie Light, and myself in 2021. And what we did in this study was we contacted manufacturers, 19 that were producing meat-based and 10 that were producing vegan, vegetarian or almost vegan pet foods, to see if there were any systemic differences in steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness and quality. And we pretty thoroughly looked at every step during the manufacturing and production process, from the initial formulation of the diet, the level of expertise that was being used. Were companies working with veterinary nutritional specialists or PhD nutritionists, or simply utilising in-house expertise, for example? What steps were they taking to ensure the nutritional soundness of diets? Were they formulating them to meet the nutritional guidelines of European or US authorities? Were they conducting feeding trials, which is when you maintain a population of animals in a laboratory, usually on the test diet as the sole nutrient intake for 6 months, and then assess them at the end of the study? Were they what steps were they taking to ensure the nutritional soundness of the ingredients that they were using? Were they actually going to the manufacturing plants where the ingredients were being produced and inspecting those? Were they relying upon paper agreements? What were they doing? Were they supplementing their diets appropriately to ensure that the diets included all of the necessary nutrients? And of course, this is something that needs to be done for both vegan diets, which wouldn't naturally include all of the nutrients required, and also meat-based diets, which might naturally include those nutrients, but many of which are degraded by the chemical treatments and temperatures and pressures of pet food processing. So fragile nutrients such as vitamins and amino acids will often lose much or all of their biological activity and then need to be supplemented from synthetic sources after processing has been completed. And the one that is best known is taurine, an amino acid that is required in the diets of cats who can't make their own taurine, and without which they will suffer from visual disorders, cardiac disorders and birth defects eventually. So the naturally occurring taurine in meat is heavily degraded by modern processing of pet foods, and after that is completed has to be added back in from a synthetic source of taurine, and the same synthetic supplementation is also used in the vegan diets. So both meat-based and vegan diets require nutritional supplementation after processing. Were the companies appropriately supplementing with all necessary nutrients? What steps are they taking to ensure the nutritional soundness was preserved? Were they using appropriate heat sterilisation to minimise contamination with bacterial microbes? Were they using cold? What other methods were they using? What additives were they using? We also looked at flavourants and colorants. Were they monitoring for degradation of nutrient levels over time, because some of them will degrade over time? Were they over supplementing appropriately to take account of nutrient degradation over time? And were they publishing appropriate protocols to preserve nutritional quality during storage and shipping, and providing those to retailers and ultimately to end stage consumers? So once we'd thoroughly looked at all of the steps involved in the design, manufacturing and indeed the storage and shipping of these pet foods, we found that most companies were doing things fairly well at most stages throughout the process. Overall, those producing the plant-based diets had a slight advantage, and we hypothesised that this might be because these diets are newer and more controversial, and it may be the case that the companies producing these diets are going the extra mile to try to ensure that their diets are nutritionally sound. Now, the next concern, the fourth concern that pet guardians said that they had before they'd be willing to consider these diets was palatability. Would their pets enjoy these diets? And it's sometimes been asserted that forcing cats and dogs to eat vegan pet food is cruel because it violates their natural feeding behaviour. To address this point, Jed Gillen, in his book Obligate Carnivore, provides the following example. He says, "Try this experiment. Skip your cat's breakfast one morning and bring him or her to the beach instead. Driven by hunger, what natural instincts might kick in? What are the chances that your cat will splash into the water, swim 50 or so miles out into the deep ocean, and thereby engage a 1,200-pound animal, because an adult tuna can be as large as a horse, in an underwater battle to the death in order to fulfill the natural feline diet of fish? The idea that fish is a natural food for cats is absurd. Cats are descended from desert creatures and they are notoriously hydrophobic. Have you ever given your cat a bath?" So he's eloquently making the point that cats, of course, have the ability to enjoy some ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them. And the same, of course, is true of dogs. Nevertheless, despite this, some argue that feeding vegan and vegetarian diets to cats and dogs is cruel. I think more productive than people arguing on either side of this debate is to ask the animals what do they think about these different diets. And of course, we can do this in dogs and cats indirectly by studying their behaviour at feeding time when offered the different diets. And so we've done this as well. This is the largest study published of feeding behaviour in dogs fed vegan versus meat-based diets. And we studied the behaviour of more than 2,300 dogs. We looked at every indicator of palatability, how much the animals enjoy their food, that had ever been described in the other scientific literature in this field, or that we were aware of from our veterinary experience. And you'll recognise many of these in your own dogs and cats, I expect, whether they wolf their food down quickly, rush up to the food bowl, wag their tail, jump up and down, bark, and so on. The first thing we did was we analysed to which degree, well, we asked people how likely the animals were to display all of these different behaviours at feeding time. And we determined which ones were more or less likely. We started by analysing how much these behaviours co-varied consistently with each other. And on the basis of that, and comparing it with previous published studies, we were able to identify some as being positive indicators, in fact 9 as being positive indicators of palatability, and 1 as being a negative indicator of palatability. Next, we looked at how the positive and negative indicators varied between the vegan and the meat-based diets. We did the same thing with cats. This time we had more than 1,100 cats, again the largest study that has been done of cats maintained on these different diets. This time there were 15 indicators of palatability, and you can see a lot of flicking of lips and noses and licking and switching of tails and so on amongst the cats. After analysing statistically the extent to which these behaviours varied consistently with each other, we were able to identify 5 as being positive indicators, 4 as being negative indicators, and in 6 cases we didn't feel we had sufficient conclusive information to be able to categorise them as positive or negative indicators. Next, we looked at the degree to which these various indicators varied between the different diets. And overall, our conclusions were consistent, by the way, with the much smaller prior studies in this field, none of which have supported viewpoints that vegan food has reduced palatability and thus may compromise the welfare of dogs or cats, providing, of course, that all the nutritional needs have been met. So we published that in 2021 in PLOS One. And the final concern that pet guardians said that they had, of course, was environmental sustainability. Now this, as I mentioned in the beginning, is an increasingly big concern, especially as climate change and environmental degradation accelerate. One of the best recent estimations of the environmental impacts of the livestock sector came from this article published in 2020 in Nature Food, one of the world's top scientific journals. And they estimated that about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system, and that the greenhouse gas emissions due to the livestock sector in particular are responsible for about 20% of all human-generated greenhouse gases. This infographic demonstrates, if you look, I suppose, at the rows number 2 and 3, the orange rows, these demonstrate the gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases that we can emit from our societies between 2020 and the end of the century, if we are to have a chance of keeping the planetary surface temperature on average to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The first row, row number 2, would give us a 2/3 chance if we emit 500 gigatons. And if we emit more carbon dioxide equivalent, 700 gigatons, that will only give us a 50% chance of keeping the planetary average surface temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. Now, if you look at the very first row at the top, you see that the emissions expected from the food system alone between 2020 and the end of the century are vastly greater than those amounts and would effectively destroy any realistic chance of us being able to keep the planetary surface temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. The final 2 rows indicate the amount of emissions that we can afford to emit if we want to have a realistic chance of keeping the planetary temperature to 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. And once again, you can see that the emissions from the food system gravely threaten our chances of meeting those targets. So this demonstrates that the food system alone is likely to sabotage any realistic chances of keeping planetary surface temperatures to reasonable levels. We know that because of a variety of positive feedback mechanisms, exceeding 1.5 degrees is expected to have relatively catastrophic consequences for our planet. Exceeding 2 degrees, of course, will be very substantially worse. So this indicates that business as usual with the food system is not an option if we are to have any realistic chance of meeting climate change goals. We have to consider major reductions in emissions from the food system. The Eat Lancet Committee was a collaboration of 37 world-leading scientists who published in 2020 recommendations for the amount of livestock produce that could be consumed in order to feed a projected future population of 10 billion people sustainably within planetary boundaries. The current population is just over 8 billion people, and we should get to 10 billion by the middle of this century. So as you can see, compared to the existing EU consumption levels in the first column, they recommended in the second column major reductions in consumption of all livestock produce categories. This is very similar in most cases to the recommendations of ProVeg International, the largest organisation campaigning and educating about plant-based lifestyles globally. They've also calculated a similar set of reductions necessary in order to feed that future population sustainably. The consequences of not making changes are becoming increasingly apparent, and there are endless examples of this that I could show you. I chose to do what any of you who have attended my lectures will know that I very often do, which is try to pop in a travel photo of my own. So this is 3,200 meters high in the French Alps, and it's where I was last week. My wife and I were about to ski down a massive glacier, which is a figure and drop about 2 kilometers in a vertical height. one of the biggest ski descents you can do in the Alps. And standing in the middle of winter on the top of the French Alps at altitude, we had temperatures of up to 14 Celsius, blazing blue, clear skies, and just incredible good weather and amounts of heat. And it was lovely for us, but it was the middle of winter in Europe, in the mountains. It should have been sub-zero. Underneath our feet, the glacier was melting. It's expected that the ski run will need to close in the next few years. And indeed, all of the European glaciers collectively have actually lost 10% of their volume just in the last 2 years. Needless to say, we didn't fly there. We took the environmentally efficient train all the way from Southampton to the French Alps, 12.5 hours. We do our best not to fly anywhere these days. We have so often been asked to consider changing our diets to less consumptive diets, and in particular to cut our consumption of livestock produce. But only very recently have people started to consider the environmental impacts of pet diets. And one of the most important studies was published by Ocken from University of California in Berkeley in 2017. And he calculated that 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts of the livestock sector, in terms of land, water, fossil fuels, phosphates and biocides and so on, are actually due to pet food. If we take the lower end of his estimate, it's just 25% of the impacts of the livestock sector, and we apply it to the figure that we already had from the Nature Food study, showing that 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions are due to the livestock sector. Now, if a quarter of those are due to pet food, then it would mean that 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are due to pet food. And that's incredibly significant because it's been calculated that the entire transport sector, so all the planes, trucks, buses, cars in the world, produce about 13.5% of all human-generated greenhouse gases. And there are armies of people working on sustainable transport as a result of this. We now have another sector, pet food, that may be responsible for 5%, so nearly a third of that figure. And there aren't armies of people working on this. There's myself, there's Ocken, there are a tiny number of other people that have done studies. There are people producing new vegan pet food products with lower environmental emissions, and that's pretty much it globally. So this is surely one of the most neglected, potentially impactful areas of our modern consumption patterns that we could tackle in order to have a positive impact on greenhouse gases. What hasn't been done until very recently is a calculation of what the changes would be, what the environmental benefits would be if the world's dogs and cats were transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets. This has been done, of course, for humans, but not for pets. So in my most recent study, I calculated the greenhouse gases that would be spared, the amount of land, water, fossil fuels and so on that would be spared, the number of food animals who would no longer be slaughtered annually, and also the number of additional people you could feed with the food energy savings. A study like this hasn't been possible until very recently because there's been no large-scale study giving good information about the ingredients used within pet food. Fortunately, such a study finally was produced by the pet food industry in the US in 2020, and it covered 2/3 of the entire US pet food market, giving detailed information about the ingredients, the species of livestock animals, the tonnages, and so on. So I calculated the dietary energy needs for dogs, cats, and for comparison, humans as well, in the US in 2020. And I examined all of those ingredients. I wanted to also calculate the impacts if dogs and cats transition globally, not just in the US. I wasn't able to use the number of dogs and cats globally in 2020 because there weren't reliable figures available, but there were for 2018. So I calculated the same impacts for the global population in 2018. Having analysed all the ingredients used in pet food, I also looked at the environmental impacts of this long list of ingredients based upon existing published data. This was a very long, complicated study, and the key results are these. Within the US, it seems that about 80% of all livestock are consumed by people and about 20% by dogs and cats. Globally, it's about 91% by people and 9% by dogs and cats, and that reflects the fact that the US is a wealthy modern nation with relatively high pet ownership compared to the global average. If all of the world's dogs and cats transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, well, in 2018, there were about 78 billion land animals being killed each year in the food system. It's now about 80 billion or more. You can see the numbers of the different species that would no longer be spared from slaughter if the world's dogs and cats were transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets. This is also reflected in this infographic here. Globally, 91% of all livestock consumption is by humans, about 8% by dogs and 1% by cats. And that equates to about 71 billion land animals being killed each year for the human food system, 6 billion land animals for dog food, and about 1 billion for cat food. The greenhouse gases that would be spared if all the world's cats were transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan cat food. This is only owned cats, by the way. It doesn't include stray or free-roaming cats or dogs who are often fed by cat colony carers or community feeding. If all the world's cats transition, you'd free up more greenhouse gases than produced by the country of New Zealand, which is a small country but has one of the biggest dairy industries in the world. If all the dogs transition, you'd spare more greenhouse gases than emitted by the entire United Kingdom. And if all the humans transitioned, you'd spare more greenhouse gases than emitted by the entire European Union. There would also be vast savings of land. If all the humans transitioned, you'd free up land larger than Russia, which is the world's largest country, combined with India. There would also be vast savings of fresh water, and millions of additional people could also be fed. If all the world's owned cats were transitioned, you would free up enough food energy to feed more than the current population of the United Kingdom. If all the dogs were transitioned, it would be more than the current population of the entire European Union. And for comparison, if all the humans were transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, you'd save enough food energy to feed 2/3 of the current population of the Earth. All of these estimates are conservative, quite conservative. So this study was very recently published in PLOS One, and since then we have published another study. Colleagues and I published a systematic review that looked at all strategies published within the scientific literature in the last 20 years to combat climate change. And this study also highlighted the major role of the food system and the importance of transitioning toward plant-based diets as well. So those are the top 5 concerns that the surveyed pet guardians said that they had about vegan diets before they would realistically be willing to consider them. The valuation of the vegan dog food and indeed the vegan pet food market more broadly, showing a rapid increase, has to be considered, bearing in mind that most pet guardians don't yet know about these studies because they've nearly all been published in the last 2 to 3 years and awareness of them is very low. These studies show that their top concerns about these vegan diets are being met by modern nutritionally sound vegan pet foods. Once the community of pet owners become aware of these studies, I think that this curve is likely to rise even faster. In closing, I'd like to make a couple of points. It's important to advise pet guardians that it's never okay to go home and attempt to formulate one's own pet food, even when following recipes and even adding nutritional supplements. I don't advise this because there have been quite a number of studies showing that such diets, unfortunately, are commonly nutritionally unsound. Instead, I suggest that people purchase diets that have been produced by reputable pet food companies that hopefully are working with veterinary nutritionists or other nutritional specialists, and can provide some reasonable information about steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness. If companies can't provide any information, don't respond to inquiries, then that should be a red flag and people should be choosing alternative companies. Secondly, animals vary a lot in their personalities. Some have a tendency, especially some dogs, to enthusiastically wolf down anything that they're offered and ask questions later. Some can be very fussy, and classically old cats are known sometimes to be very fussy and very resistant to changing from a brand that they've been used to for many years. I advise that regardless of the personality of animals, we make dietary transitions gradually, and this should, by the way, be general advice independently of feeding vegan diets or not, over ideally at least a couple of weeks, even if an animal is enthusiastic. This allows more time for digestive enzymes to transition and also for the population of microorganisms in the gastrointestinal tract to transition as well, thereby decreasing chances of adverse reactions such as diarrhea. There are various tricks that can be used to encourage animals that are used to feeding, consuming a certain diet to transition, such as providing fresh food only, gently warming the food to increase the odour of the food, bearing in mind the sense of smell is really important for cats and dogs, and certain dietary additives such as vegetable oil, nutritional yeast, spirulina, and so on. These are all provided in the advice, the summary article or summary page on my website, sustainablepetfood.info. I'm very grateful to the co-authors of my various studies, most of who are statisticians, and also to my supervisors of my recent PhD in this area as well, including Dr. Riley, who's kindly hosting this event today. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm also grateful to the other supporters that I've had. I've received funding for some of this research, including from ProVeg International and some pet food companies. However, this funding essentially funded visiting lecturers to do much of my teaching and marking for me, to free me up to spend the time on this research. None of these funders had anything to do with anything that might have in any way altered the results or analysis or publication of these studies, but I'm very grateful to the opportunity they provided me to do this research. I also wasn't able to reach more than 4,000 pet guardians on my own. I don't have that many friends on Facebook, sadly. So I had a small army of volunteers and assistants and indeed even digital marketing companies who helped me to reach so many people and conduct the largest such survey that's been done so far, and I'm grateful to them as well. As I've mentioned several times, the website where I provide summaries to these various studies is sustainablepetfood.info. So if you would like to look more closely at any of them, you can find them all there. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. I'm very grateful for that. I'm very happy to take any questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I would like to make a point. I think there was a technical error in the beginning of the presentation where some people perhaps didn't see the introduction that I did for you. So I'm very sorry if you didn't see it. I'm going to just provide a little context now, and while I do, I really encourage all of our attendees to keep adding their questions into the live Q&A, which I'll pick up directly after. So thank you again, Andrew. I've worked with Andrew now for the past 5 to 6 years, and I've known him as my Director of Centre and Professor of Animal Welfare at the University of Winchester. And of course, Andrew holds an adjunct professorship at Griffith University in Australia. Most recently, it's been my absolute pleasure to be the Director of Studies on Andrew's PhD. Andrew has the tenacity to ask all of the different difficult questions in animal welfare and spilling over into animal ethics. And certainly this is often a confrontational issue. And I know certainly from veterinary colleagues that you have faced quite a bit of opposition when all of your work was published, Andrew. So I'm extraordinarily grateful for you to be doing this presentation this evening, but also for raising awareness of this very contentious issue. I think it's very clear from all of the research summary that you've provided for us this evening that if we don't do something, then we're going to land in a much larger heap of trouble, let's say, than what we already are in. So, sorry again if you did miss the introduction. Hopefully that's provided a little context for this evening's seminar. And let's get straight on to some questions. The first one, could you clarify, Andrew, in your study, was the incidence of kidney disease actually increased in vegan cats?
Yes, so this was the only significant finding that we had. We found that there were actually 4 cats on vegan diets that were reportedly having kidney disease, which was a prevalence of 4% within that group. The prevalence within the meat-based group was 3%, so very small difference. However, because the numbers of cats were so small, there were only 4 cats in the vegan group that apparently had kidney disease. This is highly vulnerable to being affected by any anomaly, such as a greater prevalence of certain pure breeds that seem to be predisposed to having kidney disease. We didn't actually check to see what the breeds of the cats were. So if there was an anomaly like that might have affected the results, and if that had affected just a single cat in our group, and as a result, without that, the numbers had been 1 less, so 3 cats rather than 4, then the difference would no longer have been statistically significant. So it's important not to read in too much when the numbers of cats are so tiny and so vulnerable to being affected by anomalies like that. The second point to make is that the prevalence of the kidney disease in cats fed vegan diets of 4% actually matches the prevalence of kidney disease within normal cats in much larger scale studies, such as studies of many thousands of cats in British veterinary practices that have been published, giving the rates of kidney disease. So the rates of kidney disease in the vegan cats in our study actually apparently matched the normal rates of kidney disease in that study and also in other studies as well. So you know, I don't think that we can conclude too much from that particular result. In order to get, I think, a more accurate indication of the level of kidney disease in cats fed vegan diets, you would need to do a much bigger study still and be able to get larger numbers than simply 4 cats being affected in this group.
Thank you, Andrew. So we've got a request for a bit of advice, really, from Elizabeth, who says, you know, that there seems to be quite a natural resentment often and a scepticism of the Guardian reported outcomes in your studies and similar studies, particularly for people who are feeding a vegan diet to their companion animals. And with the reliance on the Guardian reported outcomes, how can we change a skeptic's mind about that? Is there any advice you can offer about the validity of those data?
Yeah, we certainly did report the opinions of pet guardians. We have no information to suggest that any bias for or against one particular diet would be any greater in those feeding vegan diets versus raw meat diets, for example. more importantly, we also reported other data as well as reporting the opinions of guardians. We report a range of much more objective data. So simply, has your animal received any kind of medication in the last year? Yes or no? Did it need to progress on to a medical diet after initially receiving a vegan or some kind of meat-based diet? How many times did it need to see the vet in the last year, looking for unusually high numbers of times? So, and also, of course, what was the assessment of the veterinarian about the health of your animal? So we reported a range of much more objective data as well as people's own opinions in our study. Some of the other studies in this field have just reported people's opinions. Some have also included laboratory analyses and veterinary clinical examinations, which are particularly objective. The systematic review recently published in this field, looking at all previously published studies in dogs and cats, made an important point. They said that even though some of this data was reported by owners, and so of their own opinions, and opinions of owners is less reliable, the beneficial findings were relatively consistent across multiple studies and should therefore not be discounted. And I'm quoting from the authors of the systematic review in this field. So I think that has to be the conclusion. There are now 10 studies in dogs and 3 studies in cats, all showing equivalent or superior health outcomes, none showing inferior outcomes for animals maintained on these diets. And the weight of evidence from all of that is quite clearly in favour of the feeding of vegan diets, providing that they're formulated to be nutritionally sound. There just isn't any credible scientific evidence to the contrary in this field at all. So how do we convince people? If anybody's open to scientific evidence and reasonableness, then I don't think that there is any other conclusion to draw.
And as you've shown so eloquently this evening, there is now a collective body of literature to help persuade people to look further into this. This isn't now just one standalone study. You know, there is a body of work and an increasing body of work and a really quick pace, more and more research becoming available, and thankfully open access research, so it's available to everyone. It's just a question of knowing that it's there.
Yeah,
Lisa,
I reviewed papers in this field on a regular basis, and I'm aware of more studies coming and studies looking at other aspects. One concern that's been raised is digestibility. Are these diets as digestible as meat-based diets? And I know of studies already published, several and more coming, demonstrating that digestibility is comparable or indeed sometimes better actually for plant-based ingredients. So that's interesting. So yeah, the weight of evidence in this field already constitutes an evidence base which is exceeds and often considerably exceeds the evidence base that supports many other commonly accepted diets and veterinary healthcare interventions, which are not being questioned. So it's interesting, I think, that people will question the use of vegan diets, sometimes looking for a standard of evidence much higher than exist to support other diets and other interventions, demonstrating a bias actually against the use of vegan diets. But as I say, the existing evidence base is already much stronger than that which supports many other diets and veterinary healthcare interventions.
And it's good to know that even more research is coming out now too, so that's really reassuring to know. A question about the availability of nutritionally sound diets. So really the question is it better for people to feed a plant-based dry to a cat rather than an animal-based tinned, given there are issues with a wet-based plant-based diet for cats and the availability of that diet?
Yep. Unfortunately, availability is a problem in some regions of the world. On my website, sustainablepetfood.info, I have a list of suppliers in various regions of the world, which certainly is not fully up to date, but it is indicative of what is out there. It seems to be much easier to source diets if you're in major cities, in the United Kingdom, perhaps North America, perhaps parts of Europe and Australia, and harder elsewhere. There may not always be wet or dry diets available. It may be one or the other. The question about wet versus dry is entirely unrelated to the question of vegan or not. It's to do with other concerns. There are various medical conditions for which one diet will be better than the other, e.g. if weight loss is being sought, then or if there is any kind of a urinary problem, usually a wet diet will be better than a dry diet as a rough rule of thumb. For environmental sustainability, there was a major study from Brazil showing dramatically increased environmental footprints when wet diets are produced compared to dry diets. So none of these are relevant to the question of vegan or not. There are other concerns that would be relevant to a choice of wet versus dry, and it can depend upon the medical situation of an individual animal.
Okay. So Maria's made the really interesting point in saying which authority designates that a cat is an obligate carnivore, and if this is the case, when we examine a commercial kibble and we tend to see less than 30% animal derived ingredients by weight, surely a cat and their dietary classification should be based on what they actually do eat and what they need to survive and reproduce. Your thoughts, Andrew?
Yes, that's a good point. It's a little known fact that just under 50% of commercial dog and cat food is actually plant materials. There are all sorts of cereals, grains, vegetables, and so on that normally go into meat-based pet food. Just over 50% is meat-based, and it's slightly higher for cat food than for dog food. Nevertheless, cats are classified as being obligate carnivores, and this relates to not what they're actually fed as domesticated cats, but what the ancestral dog or cat would naturally consume in its natural environment. And for cats in the wild, they're able to derive very little nutritional benefit from the vegetation in their natural environments, and so they're normally forced to consume a diet which is entirely prey species of animals that they've captured. They still consume some plant material from the gastrointestinal tracts of those prey animals, but it's not thought that they can derive much nutritional benefit from the plant-based material in their environments. So they're considered obligate carnivores. This, as I say, has very little relevance to domesticated dogs and cats in normal households, both of who consume diets which are far removed from those of dogs or cats in the wild or ancestral dogs or cats.
Thank you, Andrew. A question coming in from our colleague, Dr. Stephen McCulloch. How would you describe the veterinary profession's view of your findings and recommendations, and do you think the view is changing?
Yes. So I have been encouraging veterinarians to consider advising in favour of vegan pet food when they're nutritionally sound for environmental sustainability reasons and for animal welfare reasons for many years. And veterinarians have often disagreed with this, most notably, I suppose, the British Veterinary Association, who I've even debated on this issue in media interviews. And for a number of years, I've been offering to the British Veterinary Association summaries of the research on this issue and asking them to update their position to bring it in line with the scientific evidence. That's been ignored until fairly recently, and so I've been making the point in media interviews that the BVA position is actually not based on any scientific evidence. And veterinarians in particular have a duty to formulate positions upon diets that they're recommending to clients which are consistent with the scientific evidence and based on sound reasoning. So I think most veterinarians agree with that position. It's very fundamental to the veterinary profession that we are supposed to have positions which are consistent with and based on scientific evidence. To its credit, the British Veterinary Association has now recognised that there's been so much research development in this field that they have publicly committed to reviewing their position on this issue. They set up a working group to review all of the evidence on this issue, and not just vegan pet food, but other alternative diets as well. I had the pleasure of presenting to them recently. They were very interested, particularly in the environmental sustainability aspects, and we'll be publishing a revised position on vegan pet food this year, apparently, which I expect to be much more in line with the scientific evidence in this field. situation internationally is that international veterinary associations are still putting out positions, as are some non-governmental organisations, which show no awareness of two key realities. The first is all the recently published studies in this area, and the second is that most people feeding vegan pet food today are not going home and making their own diets which are nutritionally unsound. Most are actually purchasing them from pet food companies who are formulating them to be nutritionally sound. So unfortunately, most veterinarians are not aware, and most international veterinary associations do not seem to be aware yet of these two key developments in the field. So clearly, I think an education and communication campaign is even more important than further research at this stage.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've been as entertained as I have listening to Andrew's lecture on Should Cats and Dogs Go Vegan? It was an exceptionally interesting lecture and a profound lecture, realising the cost, both environmentally and to other animals, of feeding our cats and dogs a meat-based diet. This was the very first lecture from the research group, a newly formed research group at the University of Winchester, and I very hope to see you again in the near future for another public lecture. Thank you very much. Goodbye.